Welcome to this History Revision Timelines video. We'll be looking at the final events of the Cold War from 1970 to 1991 to see how the rivalry between the two superpowers finally came to an end. The content we'll be looking at is primarily focused on the Edexcel GCSE course, but I'm sure can be used for most other courses. Before delving in, just a reminder to please like and subscribe if you have found this revision video useful. In many ways, this timeline is pretty easy to get your head around, as the events can be neatly divvied up into three sections: detente, the Second Cold War, and the end of the Cold War. Before we get stuck in, I would advise downloading and completing the accompanying worksheet, which can be found in the comments section below. This period is known as detente, as it sees a relaxation of tensions between the two superpowers. A good starting point would be to ask why the superpowers needed detente. Firstly, you may remember from the previous video how close the USA and USSR had come to nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The trauma of that event had persuaded the two superpowers to look for measures that would safeguard against any potential nuclear war. Secondly, and this is oddly not covered in the Edexcel syllabus, was that the USA had become embroiled in the Vietnam War. The huge loss of life, coupled with the realization that the USA were losing the war, changed the mindset of the American people. Subsequently, the US government was under pressure to adopt a more peaceful approach to their foreign policy. Finally, the burden of competing in the arms race was having a huge toll on both the American and Soviet economies. The two superpowers looked at detente with a hope that it would alleviate the pressure to spend huge sums of money on developing weapons. The first milestone of detente was the SALT I talks, where the two superpowers agreed to limit the number of missiles each country could have. These limits were largely pointless, as each country still got to keep a nuclear arsenal that was capable of destroying the world many times over. However, the meeting was symbolic, as it showed for the first time in a long time a willingness for both countries to come to an agreement. Indeed, the positive outcome of SALT I talks prompted President Nixon to visit Moscow in what was a diplomatic first for a US president. Continuing with this wave of good feeling, the superpowers were able to coordinate three agreements at the Helsinki Accords. The first basket saw both Eastern and Western Bloc countries formally recognise each other's borders. This was a significant step towards forging international cooperation. The second basket was a commitment for countries from East and West to work closer together. This spirit of cooperation was best exemplified by the joint USA-Soviet space mission in 1975. The final basket outlined a joint agreement on the preservation of human rights. The USSR was slightly perturbed by this particular basket, as they felt it was an infringement on how they sought to wield their control over satellite state countries. Remember the Prague Spring? All in all, the Helsinki Accords can be considered the peak moment of the detente phase. However, it would be remiss to not point out that already a sour feeling was growing within the USA. That detente was enabling the Soviet Union to grow stronger whilst the US development stood still. This cartoon encapsulates this by showing a passive US president do nothing whilst the USSR premier, along with Castro, openly robs him. This bitter feeling continues to fester, and it is subsequently no surprise that the detente period will make way for a second Cold War phase. Detente struggled on for a few years after the Helsinki Accords, but came to a halt at the end of the decade when the Soviet Union decided to invade Afghanistan. This was the final straw for the US politicians, who had grown uneasy at the perception that the USSR had grown stronger and stronger. This led to the USA walking out of SALT II talks in protest. Jimmy Carter announced his disgust by pledging that the USA would go to war in order to defend its interests in the Persian Gulf. This was known as the Carter Doctrine. The decision was also made to boycott the Olympic Games that was being held in Moscow, a gesture that was returned in kind by the Soviets, who boycotted the LA Olympic Games 4 years later. This was certainly a far cry from the spirit of international cooperation that had been declared in Helsinki a few years earlier. This negativity saw the election of Ronald Reagan, who campaigned to be president on the ticket that he would be tough on the USSR. He set out by calling the USSR an evil empire, increasing military spending by 13%, and giving full support to anti-communist groups who were seeking to topple communist governments in other countries. Perhaps Reagan's showpiece policy was the announcement of the SDI program, nicknamed Star Wars. This was a fanciful idea that the USA were developing a technology that would allow them to shoot down any incoming Soviet missiles. The technology was definitely not available at the time, but it certainly made the USSR anxious that their expensively accumulated arsenal was soon to be made redundant. Indeed, the impact of Reagan's second Cold War policies meant that the USSR had little choice but to increase their own spending. As we will see, this will have notable consequences. In this final section of the timeline, the burgeoning pressure on the Soviet economy precipitated the events that led to the end of the Cold War. To deal with this economic crisis, the Soviet Union appointed Gorbachev in 1985. He essentially brought in four main changes that you need to learn. The first two focused on rebuilding the economy. He did this through perestroika, which meant rebuilding the economy with capitalist practices and by withdrawing troops from the costly war in Afghanistan. The second two changes attempted to improve relations. Gorbachev introduced glasnost to provide more openness in the Soviet government. He also reversed the Brezhnev doctrine by announcing that Soviet troops would no longer interfere with satellite states. Ronald Reagan recognized that Gorbachev was a Soviet leader he was willing to work with. In a summit meeting in Washington, the two leaders were able to sign the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty, which committed both superpowers to destroying all land-based missiles with a range of 500 to 5,500 kilometers. This is a significant de-escalation in the arms race, especially when compared to the agreements made during SALT I. Whilst the impact of Gorbachev's policies had positive effects on the superpower relations, the decision to not intervene in satellite state countries' affairs saw the USSR lose a massive sphere of its influence. The people of Eastern European countries resoundingly moved for a move away from the communism. The most famous example of this was the decision to destroy the Berlin Wall. Soon, steps were being taken to dissolve the Warsaw Pact. This put Gorbachev under immense pressure. When he made the decision to resign, the Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of its need to find a new direction. This marked the supposed end of the Cold War. Although, given recent developments with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we should really ask if the Cold War is truly over. For now though, I hope this revision timelines video has been useful. Please do like and subscribe if so. Goodbye for now.